So today I've invited myself here to talk about Bayesian networks and uncertainty. I'm going to go through briefly why they're a useful modelling technique and when we would use them. Then I'm going to give two examples, one of a data-driven Bayesian network in public health and one of an expert-driven model in conservation. So super briefly, Bayesian networks are a graphical machine learning technique based on probabilities and prior knowledge, and that's what makes them so nice here, is that we're not dealing in certain values. They're used in both conservation and human health. And super briefly, we're basically our variables, we represent them as nodes, and we join them with links, which can represent causality or correlation. And we can run scenarios by just adjusting the probability values here. So we can change from rural to 100% if we want to know what's happening in a rural area. But Bayesian networks are really nice if the data is missing or if it's low quality. So for example, in public health, you might be working with a disease where the symptoms are difficult to diagnose, so you might not be sure whether or not a person is actually infected with the disease you're looking at. In conservation, you might have problems with data with monitoring. Species might be really rare, such as the regional honeyeater, or we might have cryptic species like orchids that only pop up now and then when they fancy, which makes them quite hard to monitor. Bayesian networks are nice for this because we can supplement them with existing knowledge from experts. So a lot of the times we might not have monitoring data, but we have people who actually know from experience a lot about the species. They're nice when decisions need to be made before we have all the data. It's another common problem in both fields. So a disease outbreak will spread very quickly. We need to make a decision what we're going to do because nobody wants lots of people dying. Species can go extinct while we're busy writing management plans. So there's a Christmas Island pipistrelle that we lost recently, very sadly. Or if management plans are badly written, saying. So models can be easily updated when we're using our Bayesian networks, and that's what makes these really, really nice, is that we can give our model to a decision maker, and then they can play with it, they can run scenarios, they don't have to retrain their model, they don't need to be data modelers themselves, they can actually interact with models. They're also nice when our context is unpredictable, so this is again for both fields. And so again, in decision makers, they can run scenarios to have a look at what might happen under various different situations. Thank Colleen here for setting this up quite nicely for me. Bayesian networks in Fiji. This was a data-driven model that we did, and we wanted to look at the drivers of leptospirosis in Fiji, looking at what are the risk factors and how do they differ between different groups and across space, so urban versus versus rural environments. We had some really nice data for this study. So we had our government data, which was our spatial data, so environmental variables, right down to the household level, which they got from field work. So we had a really good range of predictor variables that we were able to draw upon. From those, we whittled it down and found the most prominent variables, the most influential, and we were able to create this Bayesian network. And from that, we were able to run our scenarios. So one of the scenarios we wanted to look at was what was the difference in the effect of poverty between urban and rural environments. So, and the first thing we found out, this was in all our scenarios, was a really big distinction here between the urban and the rural environments. So here, down here, we have the poverty level, and we have chance of being in a high-risk village. These yellow dots are all the rural scenarios. So you can see that in a rural scenario, much more likely to be in a high-risk village. In the urban scenarios, you're less likely to be in a high risk. What we found though was when it came to poverty, if you're in a rural community, with high poverty, there was a 40% increase that would be a high-risk village. So it's not surprising that in the high poverty levels, we're seeing a higher risk. However, in the urban areas, you were 2.5 times more likely to be in a high-risk village if you're in those poorer communities. So we're seeing a really big effect of poverty within these scenarios. This next bit is less about uncertainty and more about just being really cool and fun to do. So this is, Colleen touched on this briefly, this was the spatial data that we integrated. So we had our 4 most influential variables and we had a spatial layer for them. So the map of Fiji, and we were able to feed those into the Bayesian network, and from that we were able to generate a risk map. And so you can see quite clearly here, these are our urban areas, where you can see that we've got a lot lower risk factor. And you can run all sorts of scenarios about what happens if we have higher cattle density, which areas change more, and that's in the genetic software. So that's all very good, but what do we do and how do we use these models if we don't actually have any data? Well, we can ask some experts. So this is some work I did with here at UQ with the Office of Environment and State Heritage, working with the Saving Our Species program, which is an initiative of the New South Wales government aimed at saving species. And what we wanted to do was estimate the effect of management actions on threatened species. So we ran some workshops and we asked all our experts. We did 12 species, so this is the example of the Eastern Bent bat. We asked our experts to predict the highest, lowest and best guess for what they thought would happen to these populations. At the start of the program, in 5 years' time, in 20 years' time, and in 100 years' time. And we also asked them to tell us how sure they were of their estimates. And this is a pretty typical example of what we got. We see this example they actually have quite good monitoring, so they sort of know what's happening now. As we get further into the future, they start to glare at you for asking them to predict that far into the future. And they get less uncertain, they get less certain about what's going to happen. And we also asked them to run this for 3 different management scenarios. So under the current management, under a no management scenario, and under a new management scenario. So whether or not we manage cats, vegetation, or both. So getting back to how we might put this into the end, this is the one Sam and I have been working on. We can take the highest, lowest, and best guess estimates. We can adjust them based and scale them based on the certainty that we've been given, so they're all within a certain confidence level. And then we can take the lowest, the best guess, and the highest values, and create a distribution. So we see this is the lowest guess, they think it's most likely to be, and that's the highest they think the population will get to. And we can, this is using the Genie Bayesian network software now. And so you can see here that under no management, the most likely scenario in 100 years is no bats. But it's nice in that we can see that it's a distribution, so we can see, well, it's not guaranteed to be no bats, you know, there might still be some. Flicking to a management scenario, we find that the most likely scenario in 100 years, it scales a bit out, so if we go to 20 years, for example, is about 50,000. So under a management scenario, we can see our species is probably going to do okay. Now what we can do is say, well, what if we managed half of our population? We can see the contribution of the no management, so most likely to go extinct. But on average, we're most likely to have about 30,000 if we manage half of them. So we can merge these distributions to see what proportion is managed versus not managed to get an idea of what's most likely going to happen. There are a whole lot of ecological assumptions around this. I can see some ecologists starting to put like theirs. But we're working on those. So in conclusion, conservation and human health both exist in this really uncertain context. But in both of these fields, we have to make decisions regardless of whether or not we have all the information. And Bayesian networks are a really useful tool for modelling this, and also a really good example about how developments in one field can be used in another field. So if one field makes advances in one technology, we need to make sure we're carrying that over and that everyone is benefiting from